Raymond Smith expected his first blind date in years to end in polite failure, awkward small talk, an early exit, back to blueprints in his daughter's locked bedroom door. He was a widowed architect who'd stopped believing in second foundations. But 30 seconds after sitting down in the amber-lit lounge, the woman across from him lowered her jacket to reveal deep, textured scars carved across her shoulder and said flatly, "No one wants to date me, mister." The room seemed to hold its breath. He could stand and walk away like the others surely had, murmur something about early meetings and unfinished designs. Or he could do what no one expected, lean forward and say, "My daughter won't leave her room anymore. She thinks she's broken beyond repair. Maybe you could help me prove her wrong." One choice, made in the space between heartbeats, would reconstruct 3 lives forever. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel, and it proves that powerful stories resonate everywhere. Sarah Webb arrived at Raymond's house on a Saturday morning with a leather portfolio under her arm. Raymond had given her the address 3 days after their disastrous coffee shop meeting, and she'd waited 2 full days before responding with a single word: Saturday. She didn't know why she'd agreed to come. Maybe because Raymond hadn't looked at her scars with pity. Maybe because she recognized something familiar in the way he described his daughter, that specific kind of self-imposed exile that came from believing the world had no place for you anymore. The house was exactly what Sarah expected from a high-end architect, modern, minimalist, full of light and clean lines. Everything was in its proper place. Raymond met her at the door and explained, with the same clinical precision he probably used with clients, that his daughter Elena had been hiding in her bedroom for 4 months. The girl would eat food left outside her door and shower late at night when she thought her father was asleep, but she refused to come out, refused to return to school, refused to see the friends who'd stopped calling after the 3rd month of rejection. Raymond told Sarah about the fire. It had happened at a sleepover, a small electrical fire in a friend's house, contained quickly. Everyone evacuated safely, but Elena had been closest to flames. The burns covered her left arm and crept up onto her neck. The doctors said they weren't that bad, relatively speaking. They said she'd been lucky. They said she'd heal. But Elena had looked in the mirror afterward and decided she was finished with the visible world. She'd retreated into her room and refused to participate in life anymore. Sarah understood this completely. She'd done the same thing after her own accident 3 years ago. A car crash on a mountain road. The vehicle catching fire. Her trapped in the driver's seat for 7 minutes before someone pulled her free. The burns had covered nearly 40% of her body. She'd spent 2 years hiding before she'd finally forced herself back into public spaces. And even now, she led with her scars as a defense mechanism, showing them immediately so people could reject her quickly, and she could move on without wasting time on hope. Raymond didn't ask Sarah to fix his daughter. He simply walked at Elena's closed bedroom door and said he'd tried everything: therapy, medication, patience, tough love. Nothing worked. His late wife would have known what to do, he said. She'd always understood people in ways he didn't. He understood structures and systems, load-bearing walls and foundation issues. But human emotion was a language he'd never quite mastered. He'd been hoping, he admitted, that Sarah might speak that language fluently enough for both of them. Sarah told him she wasn't a therapist. She wasn't qualified to help anyone. She could barely help herself most days. But she also said she'd try, because she remembered what it felt like to be trapped behind a door, convinced that the world outside was hostile territory, designed for people who looked normal, who fit in, who hadn't been marked by fire. She started simply. She didn't knock on Elena's door or try to coax her out with speeches about bravery and healing. Instead, she sat down in the hallway outside the bedroom, opened her portfolio, and began to draw. She drew cities that didn't exist, places where scars were considered beautiful, where difference was celebrated as design rather than defect. She drew buildings with irregular shapes and asymmetrical windows, streets that curved unpredictably, monuments dedicated to survival rather than perfection. After an hour, she slid the first drawing under Elena's door without saying a word. Then she left. She came back the next Saturday and did the same thing. And the Saturday after that. She never spoke, never asked for acknowledgement, never demanded that Elena engage. She just drew and slid the papers under the door, building an invisible bridge between the hallway and the hidden room one sketch at a time. On the fourth Saturday, when Sarah slid a drawing under the door, it didn't lie flat on the floor. Someone on the other side was holding it, reading it. Sarah heard the faint sound of paper rustling, then nothing. She waited 30 seconds, then stood to leave. That's when the door opened. Just a crack, just enough for Sarah to see a sliver of a girl's face, pale and careful. Elena didn't say anything. She just looked at Sarah with the same guarded expression Sarah had worn at that coffee shop a month ago. Then she held up one of the drawings Sarah had made, a sketch of a tower with windows that looked like scars, beautiful and structural and necessary, and nodded once before closing the door again. Raymond, who'd been watching from the end of the hallway, looked at Sarah with something that might have been gratitude or hope or relief. Sarah couldn't tell which. She told him not to celebrate yet. Opening a door by a crack wasn't the same as walking through it, but it was a start. It was a first line on a blueprint that might eventually become something solid. The following week, Elena opened the door wider. Not enough to step out, but enough to sit in the doorway while Sarah drew. The girl watched in silence, studying the way Sarah's scarred hands moved across the paper, creating structures that shouldn't work but somehow did. After an hour, Elena asked Sarah if the scars hurt. Sarah said yes, sometimes. She said phantom pain was real, that nerve damage created sensations that didn't make logical sense, that some days she felt like she was still burning even though the fire had been extinguished years ago. Elena asked if it got better. Sarah told her the truth. It got different. Not better, not worse, just different. You learned to carry it. You learned that survival wasn't the same as being whole, but it was enough. You learned that people who couldn't look at your scars weren't worth your time, and people who were rare and valuable. Elena asked why Sarah had come to help her. Sarah said she hadn't come to help. She'd come because Raymond had asked, and because she remembered being locked in a room, metaphorically speaking, and how lonely it was. She said she didn't know if she was helping at all. Maybe she was just drawing pictures for herself, and Elena was a witness. Maybe this whole thing was pointless. But Elena shook her head and said it wasn't pointless. She said the drawings made her feel less alone, less like a mistake. She said she'd been thinking maybe if Sarah could survive her scars, maybe Elena could too. Not today, not this week, but eventually. Sarah told her that was enough. Eventually was a perfectly good timeline. Raymond started finding excuses to be home on Saturdays. He'd claim he needed to review plans or make phone calls, but really he was watching Sarah and Elena from a distance, observing the way his daughter slowly emerged from her self-imposed exile. First she sat in the doorway, then she sat in the hallway, then she moved to the living room, still keeping distance from the windows where neighbors might see her, but present nonetheless. Sarah never pushed. She never treated Elena's progress as a project with milestones and deadlines. She simply existed alongside the girl, drawing and talking occasionally about nothing important. What kind of pizza was best, whether cats or dogs were superior, what music was worth listening to. Surface-level conversations that somehow felt deeper than therapy ever had. Raymond found himself drawn into these Saturday sessions without intending to be. He'd sit on the opposite side of the room, pretending to work on his laptop, but actually listening to Sarah describe her life after the accident. She talked about how she'd lost her job because she couldn't face customers anymore, how she'd burned through her savings, how she'd eventually found work doing freelance graphic design from home because it didn't require being seen. She talked about the dates that had ended badly, the friends who'd slowly stopped calling, the family members who meant well but didn't understand that pity was worse than cruelty. Elena asked if Sarah was lonely. Sarah said yes, constantly. She said loneliness was the worst part of scarring, worse than pain, worse than stares, worse than anything physical. The isolation was what truly damaged you, the sense that you'd been permanently exiled from normal human connection. Raymond found himself speaking before he'd thought it through. He said he understood that feeling. After his wife died, people had treated him like he was contagious with grief. They'd brought casseroles and offered condolences, but kept their distance, as if widowhood might transfer through proximity. He'd thrown himself into work because buildings didn't require emotional navigation. Buildings made sense. People didn't. Sarah looked at him with an expression, He couldn't quite read, and said maybe that's why they've been put in each other's path. Maybe broken people recognize each other. Maybe they could build something functional out of their collective damage. The conversation shifted after that. Raymond started staying in the room instead of pretending to work. He started asking Sarah questions about her life, her art, her thoughts on architecture and design. She had opinions, strong ones, about the way modern buildings prioritize aesthetic over humanity, about how spaces should accommodate difference rather than demand conformity. Raymond found himself disagreeing with her on technical points, and those disagreements turned into debates that lasted hours. Elena watching them both was something that looked almost like amusement. One Saturday, after Elena had gone back to her room for the night, Sarah stayed later than usual. She and Raymond sat on the terrace overlooking the city, drinking wine and talking about things that had nothing to do with scars or daughters or grief. They talked about travel and ambition, and the strange ways life rearranged itself without permission. Raymond admitted he'd been furious at his wife for dying, which made him feel monstrous, but was true nonetheless. Sarah admitted she sometimes wished she'd died in the accident instead of surviving it, which made her feel equally monstrous, but was also true. Raymond asked if she'd ever considered that surviving meant something. Sarah said she considered it constantly and hadn't reached any conclusions. Some days survival felt like punishment. Other days it felt like defiance. Most days it just felt like existence without purpose. Raymond said maybe purpose wasn't something you found. Maybe it was something you built. He said he'd been building structures his entire adult life, but they were all empty until people filled them with meaning. Maybe people worked the same way. Maybe you constructed yourself piece by piece until you became something functional, even if you'd never be what you were before. Sarah said that was the most architectural approach to trauma she'd ever heard. Raymond said he didn't know any other way to think about problems. Sarah said that was both his strength and his limitation. They sat in silence for a while. The city lights spread below them like a blueprint made of stars. Raymond thought about reaching for Sarah's hand, but didn't. The moment felt too fragile, too new. He didn't want to rush the foundation before it had time to set properly. Sarah eventually said she should go. Raymond walked her to the door and thanked her for coming, for helping Elena, for existing in their lives. Sarah said she wasn't sure she'd helped anything. She said Elena was still hiding, still scared, still convinced the world would reject her. Raymond said that was true. But Elena was also sitting in the living room now, talking to another human being, imagining a future where she might leave the house eventually. That was progress. That was structure where there had been none before. Sarah smiled, a real smile, not the defensive one she used as armor, and said maybe Raymond was right. Maybe they were building something. She just hoped it wouldn't collapse under its own weight. After she left, Raymond checked on Elena. His daughter was awake, sitting up in bed with Sarah's drawings spread around her like blueprints for a different life. She asked if Raymond liked Sarah. Raymond said he did. Elena asked if Sarah liked him back. Raymond said he didn't know. Elena said Sarah looked at Raymond the way people in movies looked at each other before they kissed. Raymond said Elena watched too many movies. Elena said Raymond didn't watch enough of them, which was why he was bad at reading people. Raymond asked if Elena would be okay with him spending time with Sarah outside of their Saturday sessions. Elena said yes, obviously. She said it was weird that he was asking permission from his 11-year-old daughter about his love life. She said he should just ask Sarah on a real date and stop pretending this was all about helping Elena. Raymond said it was about helping Elena. Elena said it had started that way, but it wasn't anymore. She said she could see the way her father looked at Sarah when he thought no one was watching. She said it was the same way he used to look at her mother, like he was solving a complicated equation, and the answer was both terrifying and inevitable. Raymond told Elena to go to sleep. Elena said she would, but only if Raymond promised to stop being scared of everything. She said her mother wouldn't want him to spend the rest of his life hiding behind work and grief. She said scarring was terrible, but giving up was worse. Raymond sat on the edge of Elena's bed and told her she was too wise for 11. Elena said someone in this family had to be emotionally intelligent. Raymond said that was probably true. That night, Raymond lay awake thinking about load-bearing walls, the structural elements that hold everything else up, that carry weight invisibly, that determined whether a building stands or collapses. He'd spent his career calculating those tolerances, determining what could be safely supported. But he'd never applied that thinking to his own life. Never asked himself what weight he could carry, what foundation he was building on. Sarah had called herself broken. Elena believed she was ruined. But Raymond looked at them both and saw something different. He saw survivors who'd been tested beyond normal limits and hadn't failed. Even if they felt like they had, he saw strength disguised as damage. The question was whether 3 damaged people could form a stable structure or whether they'd simply create a more complicated collapse. Listen, if you're still here, it means you're invested. You want to see what happens next. But here's the reality. Most people watch stories like this and scroll away without subscribing. They enjoy it, then vanish. If this story actually matters to you, if you genuinely care about how it ends, hit that subscribe button. It only takes a second. Otherwise, you'll probably forget this channel exists and miss all the other incredible stories I share. Elena's school called on a Tuesday morning. Her art teacher, Mrs. Chun, had been following Elena's case since the accident and wanted to include some of Elena's pre-fire artwork in the school's annual spring exhibition. The teacher thought it might help Elena feel connected to her school community again, might remind her that she had a place waiting for her when she was ready to return. Raymond brought the proposal to Elena carefully, framing it as completely optional, zero pressure, just an opportunity if she wanted it. Elena surprised him by saying yes immediately. She said she'd been thinking about Sarah's drawings, about the idea that art could exist publicly without the artist needing to be present. Maybe this was a way to participate, without actually being seen. But Mrs. Chun had a different vision. She called Raymond back that afternoon and explained that the exhibition had a theme this year, resilience. She wanted Elena to create a new piece specifically for the show, something that reflected her journey. And she wanted Elena to attend the opening reception. Raymond said no immediately. Elena wasn't ready for public appearances. The girl barely left her bedroom. A crowded school gymnasium full of staring people would destroy the fragile progress they'd made. But Mrs. Chun was persistent. She said Elena needed goals, needed challenges, needed reasons to push past her comfort zone. She said hiding forever was a resilience. Facing the world despite fear was. Raymond called Sarah that night and explained the situation. He said he didn't know what to do. Force Elena to attend and risk traumatizing her further, or protect her comfort zone and confirm her belief that she couldn't handle normal life. Both options felt like failure. Sarah asked what Elena wanted. Raymond admitted he hadn't asked her directly. He'd been too busy trying to make the decision for her, trying to calculate the structural integrity of various approaches. Sarah said maybe that was a problem. Maybe Elena needed to make her own choices about her own life, even if those choices led to pain or failure. Raymond argued that Elena was 11 years old. 11-year-olds didn't have the perspective to make major decisions. Sarah said Elena had survived a fire that most adults couldn't handle. She said trauma had a way of aging people prematurely, teaching lessons that shouldn't be learned so young, but were nonetheless real. She said Raymond needed to trust that Elena could navigate her own recovery, even if that navigation looked different than his architect's plans. The next Saturday, Sarah brought the conversation directly to Elena. She asked if Elena wanted to participate in the exhibition, or if she was only agreeing because adults were pressuring her. Elena said she wanted to try. She said she was tired of hiding, tired of feeling like her life had ended at 11, tired of letting fear make all her decisions. But she was also terrified. She said she didn't know if she could walk into a room full of people who'd remember her from before, who'd see her now and compare the two versions, who'd whisper and stare and pity her. Sarah told Elena that all those things would definitely happen. People would stare. People would whisper. Some would pity her. Others would be cruel. Most would be awkwardly uncomfortable. But Sarah said that happened anyway, if not at the exhibition, then at a grocery store eventually, or a movie theater, or a friend's house. Hiding postponed the inevitable but didn't prevent it. Elena asked Sarah to come with her to the exhibition. Sarah said yes without hesitation, even though Raymond could see the fear flash across her face. Sarah had been avoiding public events for years. A crowded school gymnasium was exactly the kind of exposure she'd trained herself to prevent. The three of them spent the next month preparing. Elena created a mixed media piece, a self-portrait that incorporated some of Sarah's architectural sketches, photographs from before the fire, and abstract representations of flame and survival. The work was raw and painful and honest in ways that made Raymond's chest ache. His daughter had captured something true about trauma, the way it destroyed one version of yourself while creating another, neither better nor worse, just different. The night of the exhibition arrived too quickly. Elena changed outfits 4 times, trying to find something that covered her scars without looking like she was hiding them. Sarah wore a dress with 3/4 sleeves, a compromise between exposure and protection. Raymond wore a suit because he didn't know what else to do with his nervous energy. They arrived early before the crowds. Mrs. Chu met them at the entrance and walked Elena to her piece, which had been given prominent placement near the center of the gymnasium. Other parents and students were already milling around, examining artwork, making polite conversation. Raymond watched people notice Elena, watched their expressions shift from curiosity to recognition to carefully control neutrality. Elena stood frozen in front of her artwork. Sarah stood beside her, visibly tense but present. Raymond positioned himself slightly behind them both, trying to be supportive without being protective, trying to trust that they could handle whatever came next. Then Marcus Chun, a boy from Elena's former class, walked up with his parents. Marcus had been at the sleepover where the fire happened. He'd escaped without injury, without trauma, without any marks to show he'd been there. He looked at Elena's artwork for a long moment, then looked at Elena herself, and said loudly enough for nearby people to hear, "You used to be so pretty. It's really sad what happened to you." The words hung in the air like structural failure. Raymond felt his entire body tense, ready to intervene, ready to remove his daughter from the situation immediately. But before he could move, Sarah stepped forward. She didn't yell. She didn't shame Marcus or lecture him about cruelty. She simply pulled up her sleeve completely, revealing the full extent of her scars, worse than Elena's, more visible, impossible to ignore, and said to the boy, "You know what's actually sad? Growing up to be the kind of person who measures worth by appearance." Elena survived something terrifying. She created something beautiful from that survival. What have you done lately besides state the obvious? Marcus's parents looked mortified. Marcus himself looked confused, like he'd expected agreement rather than confrontation. Other people nearby had stopped pretending not to listen. The gymnasium had gone quiet. Elena, who'd been on the verge of tears, suddenly laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, almost shocked but genuine. She looked at Sarah with something like awe and said, "I can't believe you just did that." Sarah shrugged and said, "Someone needed to." The evening continued. More people came. More people stared. But something had shifted. Elena stopped trying to hide her scars and started explaining her artwork instead. She talked about fire and survival and the strange beauty of imperfection. Some people listened with genuine interest. Others made excuses and moved on quickly. But Elena handled both reactions with a steadiness that surprised everyone, including herself. Halfway through the reception, Elena had a panic attack. Not because of cruelty or stares, but simply because the sustained exposure was overwhelming. Her breathing accelerated. Her hands started shaking. Her vision tunneled. Raymond and Sarah immediately flanked her, creating a physical barrier between Elena and the crowd. Sarah talked her through the breathing exercises she'd learned in her own therapy. Raymond texted Mrs. Chan to say they were leaving. But Elena, even in the middle of her panic, said no. She said she wanted to stay. She said panic attacks were part of her new normal, and she'd have them whether she was at school or locked in her bedroom. So she might as well have them while doing something brave. They compromised. Elena sat outside the gymnasium for 20 minutes, recovering in the quiet hallway, then returned for the final 30 minutes of the exhibition. She didn't talk to anyone else. She didn't view any other artwork. She just stood near her piece, existing in public, proving to herself that she could. On the drive home, Elena said it had been the hardest thing she'd ever done, including surviving the actual fire. She said she didn't know if she could do it again. Sarah said she didn't have to do it again tomorrow. She just had to remember that she'd done it once, which meant it was possible. Raymond looked at both of them Exhausted, damaged, incredibly brave, and realized his carefully calculated plans had been irrelevant. They'd built something together that didn't follow any blueprint he'd designed, and it was stronger because of that. 6 months after the exhibition, Raymond's newest project broke ground. But this wasn't another corporate skyscraper or luxury residential tower. This was a community center in an underserved neighborhood, designed specifically to provide free art therapy and support services for trauma survivors. The project had started as a conversation between Raymond and Sarah one night on his terrace. Sarah had mentioned how rare and expensive good therapy was, how most people with trauma couldn't afford the kind of intensive treatment that might actually help them. Raymond had started sketching immediately, his brain automatically converting problems into structural solutions, and within weeks he presented Sarah with preliminary plans for a space that could serve as a refuge for people like them. He'd secured funding through a combination of his own money, grants, and donations from colleagues in the architecture community. Sarah had agreed to run the art therapy programs. Elena, now 12 and attending school regularly, had volunteered to help with youth outreach. The center would be called Reconstruction, a name that applied equally to buildings and lives. The groundbreaking ceremony was small, just close friends and family and future program participants. Elena gave a short speech about survival and community that made Raymond cry despite his best efforts to maintain professional composure. Sarah unveiled the architectural renderings, which incorporated design elements from her drawings, those imaginary cities where difference was celebrated rather than hidden. Raymond's cousin Juliana attended, though she'd been skeptical of the project from the start. She'd warned Raymond repeatedly about building his life around trauma, about centering his daughter's recovery and his relationship with Sarah on shared damage. She said that foundations built on pain were inherently unstable, that he was setting everyone up for eventual collapse. But watching the ceremony, seeing Elena comfortable in her own skin and Sarah smiling without that defensive edge, Juliana had to admit she might have been wrong. Maybe shared trauma wasn't a weakness. Maybe it was just another way of understanding each other, another form of structural integrity. After the ceremony, Sarah found Raymond standing alone near the construction site, looking at the empty lot that would soon become their center. She asked if he was having second thoughts. Raymond said no. He was just calculating load distribution, making sure the foundation would support everything they were planning to build on top of it. Sarah said he was doing the thing again where he treated emotions like engineering problems. Raymond said he couldn't help it. It was how his brain worked. Sarah said she knew, and she found it simultaneously frustrating and endearing. They'd been dating officially for 4 months now, though their relationship had existed in some undefined form for much longer than that. They'd taken things slowly, carefully, both of them afraid of adding too much weight too quickly and causing structural failure. But somewhere along the way, slow had become comfortable. Careful had become trusting. Raymond asked Sarah to move in with him. He'd been planning to ask for weeks, but kept finding reasons to delay, waiting for the right moment, the right words, the right structural analysis of whether their foundation could support the additional load. But standing there at the construction site, looking at this thing they'd built together from nothing but shared pain and stubborn hope, he realized there would never be a perfect moment. There was just now, and the choice to build or not build. Sarah said yes, but with conditions. She said she needed her own space within the house, somewhere she could retreat when the world became too much. She said she'd had bad days where she couldn't be supportive or present, days where her own trauma management required all her energy. She said she wasn't interested in being saved or fixed or made whole. She was interested in being accepted exactly as she was, scars and limitations included. Raymond said those were the easiest conditions he'd ever agreed to. He said he designed an addition to the house specifically for her, a studio space with natural light and privacy and all the architectural features she wanted. He said he didn't want to save her or fix her. He wanted to build something new alongside her, something that hadn't existed before they'd met. Elena, who'd been eavesdropping from behind a temporary construction barrier, emerged and said it was about time. She said watching her father try to be subtle about his feelings had been excruciating. She said Sarah had been practically living with them anyway, so making it official just meant fewer awkward goodbyes at the door. The three of them stood together looking at the empty lot, imagining the structure that would rise there, the lives it would impact, the community it would create. Raymond thought about how a year ago he'd been convinced his life was finished, that raising Elena alone while managing his own grief was all he could handle, all he was capable of. He'd been wrong. He'd been capable of more. He just hadn't known it yet. Sarah thought about how a year ago she'd been using her scars as a weapon to keep people at a distance, convinced that isolation was safer than vulnerability. She'd been wrong, too. Vulnerability was terrifying, but it was also the only way to build genuine connection. Elena thought about how a year ago she believed her life was over at 11, that the fire had taken everything worth having. She'd been the most wrong of all. The fire had taken things, yes, comfort and certainty and a particular kind of invisibility that came with being conventionally attractive, but it had also given her things. Strength and perspective and the ability to recognize other survivors when she met them. Raymond told his daughter and his girlfriend. The word still felt strange, but increasingly right, that the center would take approximately 18 months to build, assuming no major complications. He explained the construction timeline in detail. Foundation work, framing, systems installation, finishing, because talking about structures calmed him even when his emotions felt chaotic. Sarah interrupted his explanation to point out that he was doing the thing again. Raymond asked what thing. Elena said the thing where he hid behind blueprints and timelines instead of acknowledging feelings directly. Raymond admitted they were right. He said he was terrible at expressing emotions without technical metaphors. He said he loved them both in ways he couldn't quantify or calculate, and building the center together was the closest he could come to explaining what their presence in his life meant. Sarah said that was actually pretty romantic for an architect. Elena said it was extremely weird, but also kind of sweet. They stood there together as construction crews began the preliminary work of preparing the site, watching the first steps of building something permanent from temporary materials. Raymond thought about structural integrity one final time, not as an engineering problem, but as a philosophical question. Were they building on solid ground or unstable soil? Would this structure hold or eventually collapse? He didn't know. No one could know with certainty. Every building was an act of faith, a belief that proper design and good materials and skilled construction could overcome gravity and weather and time. But looking at Sarah and Elena, both scarred and strong and willing to risk building something new, Raymond decided faith was enough. They weren't broken. They weren't damaged beyond repair. They were just people who'd survived fires, learning how to construct futures from the materials they had left. And sometimes that was the strongest foundation of all. The architecture of scars teaches us that trauma doesn't disqualify us from love, connection, or purpose. It simply reshapes the foundation we build upon. Raymond, Sarah, and Elena discovered that healing isn't about erasing damage or returning to who we were before. It's about accepting our scars as part of our structural integrity and building something new from that honest foundation. The story reminds us that vulnerability is strength, that shared pain can create profound understanding, and that the bravest act isn't hiding our broken places, but allowing others to see them and choosing to stand visible anyway. Most importantly, it shows that family isn't defined by perfection or wholeness, but by the willingness to construct something meaningful together, even when every person brings their own damage to the blueprint. Sometimes the strongest structures are built not despite our cracks, but because of them. So here's the real question. Did you subscribe yet? Thousands of people will listen to this story and won't subscribe. Please don't be that person. Kindly support what I do here by subscribing. And then drop in the comment section if you'd like to hear more about Raymond, Sarah, and Elena's journey. What challenges will they face as reconstruction opens its doors? How will they help other survivors rebuild their lives? Will Sarah's past come back to test their new foundation? Let me know if you want to hear what happens when 3 broken people finish building their home.